Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday, February 7th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle Cluster API breakout meeting. Today we have a nice discussion topic to start us off, which is, I think, something we've talked about a little bit before, but has sort of come back around in recent discussions inside of Google, and we wanted to talk about it in this forum as well. And that is whether we should be using CRDs or API aggregation for the machine API and the cluster API. So Fang, do you want to kick the discussion off? I know you've been spending a lot of time doing the migration from CRDs to API aggregation.
All right.
Thanks.
So in the last week, I sort of busy to migrate all the functionality from our current CRD implementation to the API aggregation. So it's almost there. But I want to discuss with the community, so to see look for the opinion in terms of which one is actually better in terms of this deployment for this effort. Because from API point of view, it's actually not much different. From the front end, they're using the same API, right? They don't really see this is API aggregation or it's CRD. But from deployment perspective, this is different. And from what I can see, the CRD, the obvious advantage for CRD is just very simple, and that's probably all the effort around this. Everyone start pick up CRD as a starting point. There's already couple of implementation, not just Cluster API, but including other effort. They are also choosing the CRD. The downside for CRD is lacking some important feature support, or for example, they don't have a way to do the validation, versioning for the different API version. Some of this support, I think the API, the Google team is also working on improving the CRD support to add in this feature. So some feature I believe will be coming soon, even we are not there today. For the API aggregation, of course, it's a fully functional API server. So it has all the feature we needed. And it's bring additional flexibility for deployment, which means we can deploy the API server outside of the cluster. So for some scenario, and for GKE, for example, I think could be bring some advantage. I'm sure for other deployment scenario, there'll be value too. So another thing to consider is for the CRD, because it delivers many API server, so you don't worry about the patching or whatever. So every API server go to next version. If there's issue, get a fix. So you automatically get benefit from that. If you're using API aggregation, it's API server library is branched out. So there will be some sync between here and there. So when the issue get fixed, we need to pull into the API server extension, a branch, and get fixed there. So that's one of the downsides using the API aggregation. So here I will just initiate this discussion. I would really like to see what you guys think. CRD or API aggregation?
From our experience, the API server is the best approach because there was pull request several months ago, which I'm not sure that has been merged, to add to custom resource the possibility to add the status, the scale sub-resource, and also the metadata generation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. There's no sub-resource in CRD.
I mean, there was the pull request, and I have to check it right now and see if it's already merged. But those things are very crucial in order to get stable API. I'll just check it right now.
All right, thanks, Martin. Just to give a little bit more background, this came up in a conversation with Eric Toon a couple days ago, who's been one of the sort of leaders in like the SIG apps space and sort of defining application logic. He's been working with a lot of other teams that are building in the Kubernetes ecosystem, and he's been encouraging them to use CRDs whenever they can. And his reasons for doing that are that you don't have to fork and rebase code, right? So Fang mentioned that we would be responsible for keeping up with our rebasing our own API server version. That you don't have to run a separate etcd. You have lower net memory requirements. He also points out that CRDs today can do some validation of fields, can use and do defaulting using a webhook, and that he expects that CRDs will have things like multi-version support in either 110 or 111, and are likely to get things like metadata generation support and a status sub-resource support, even though those things are not on the near-term roadmap. Things like strategic merge patch support is being discussed, but has not been committed to. And they're likely to get sort of, if there's a lot of momentum around them, better sort of development framework and tools. So I think those are sort of his reasons for sort of trying to push people towards CRDs, which kind of caught us a little bit by surprise, since in, I think, both this forum and internally, we'd been thinking that API aggregation was sort of clearly the right way to go. And he seemed to be surprised that we'd drawn that conclusion. So before I go into any rebuttals of any of those points, I'd like to hear, so Martin, you were looking at the status thing. I think that is still like it's still in the future, right? It's not anywhere, not going.
Yeah, there was a pull request because those 3 resources, I had to check it.
Robert, we just in the service catalog SIG, we had Eric Toon come and give a little brief talk on this as well, and he had some slides. I think maybe the same slides you're talking about or talking from. Would it be helpful to put a link to those slides in the meeting notes just so other people can have that? If you don't have a link, I can add it.
If you have a link, that'd be great. I have a set of slides, but I can't tell who they're shared with or if they're visible outside of Google, which is always fun, because it's kind of difficult sometimes for us to share documents outside of the company. So if you have a link to slides, if you could paste them into the chat or stick them in the meeting notes, that would be great. And I can verify those are the same slides I'm looking at. Yes.
So yeah, another thing.
Thank you.
So I also would like to see what you guys thinking about the deploy this like API server outside the cluster. Is this a compelling reason if we choose the API server route? Because for CRD, you can only deploy inside the cluster.
That's not entirely true. So when we were talking with Eric yesterday, what he was saying was you could still use CRDs outside the cluster by running a standard API server with all of the core resources turned off and just CRDs turned on. So you can still get the benefit of having the sort of the separation of concerns, where you run the core API server for things like pods and replica sets. You run a second API server where you turn all that stuff off and you just run CRDs and you install your machine CRDs, and you can still do API aggregation across the two. So there actually is a way to not fork the code, use the existing API server, and still have the flexible deployment model. So I think that was his rebuttal to my suggestion that was a strong reason for us to do it. Daniel Smith was also in the discussion, and he mentioned that they're thinking about building a sort of control plane in a box, where they basically have a main function that drops you into the API server with a whole bunch of flags set to sort of give you that experience, and etcd running inside the same binary as well. So you'd have sort of a single deployment container that would be like, here is my API server.
But if you're running another API server, another API server to host the CRD, it means the benefit of same storage is gone, right? You need a separate storage. So what's the point?
Yes. Right. So I don't know if Chris is on the call. Chris and I were talking about this. Chris Rousey and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday at our desks. And we had a couple of other thoughts here. So one of which is, so CRDs are working on multi-version support, but they might come in 1.10, they might come 1.11. I'm not sure we want to wait 6 or 9 months for those things to show up and sort of block our progress on that. The running a separate etcd I don't think is necessarily a problem in our case, because I think we actually want to have separate storage. You were saying like having consolidated storage gives you a lower memory footprint, but having separate storage gives you a separate failure domain. And so if you blow up your etcd because you have a job that runs out of creating pods and etcd ooms, you still want to be able to see the machines in your cluster and still be able to repair machines in your cluster. So it's actually a benefit for us to run a separate etcd. I think lower net memory requirements, given our deployment model, is kind of a toss-up, because as you said, if we're running a separate API server with everything turned off except CRDs and a separate storage, like it doesn't really matter if it's our own API server or if it's the core one with CRDs instead of aggregated APIs. And I think that even if they're talking about adding a status sub-resource, there's some other sub-resources that we're interested in. So Martin mentioned the scale sub-resource. And we talked before about possibly creating other custom sub-resources for machines. Like you might imagine like a reboot sub-resource, right? That is a machine-specific sub-resource. And I have not seen any plans with CRDs to add custom sub-resources.
But especially for scale, I think there's a plan also to implement this for CRDs.
Yeah, I've added it into the meeting minutes. There's a pull request, and it was recently updated, so it will be soon.
So it sounds like scale and status are both on the table for CRDs.
So it's for status, and I believe for the, let me just check it. Yeah, so they add status and scale.
Okay, excellent. So sort of the two, I think, probably most common ones are likely being added. But if we did want to add other sort of custom verbs for machines, I think that would probably be difficult to do with CRDs. It's not clear if we want to or not, but that's something that we've thrown out there as a possible idea. So Martin, it sounds like from the things you pointed out from your experience of status and scale sub-resources generate metadata, those look like they're all sort of on a table to be added to CRDs to sort of close those gaps. Are there any other reasons that you guys have found running a separate API server is beneficial?
I mean, just having more or less the Lifecycle plugins, so we might want to have like different authentication for those kinds of resources. So it gives us far more flexibility in that domain, and also the admission plugins. Well, you use like a webhook, what they are called, the remote plugins, the remote admission plugins, and well, better defaulting, and pretty much those things. Better defaulting and better validation. So if you have X and Y, you need to have also Z as well, and this is currently not possible to be done with the machine API, with the CRDs.
Yeah, so Eric mentioned in his slides that starting in I don't know what version he was running, as of 1.9, you can do complex validation using a validating webhook, where you can say if field A is set, then field B must also be set. And you can also use defaulting using a mutating webhook, where you can say if field A is not set, then set field B to foo. So that's on slide 4 of the slides that Matthew linked into the chat. Does that sort of address those two things you just mentioned?
Yeah, I have to check them, but I don't know. It feels far more natural just to run your own API server for this use case, especially if you need to do some complex validation that you don't want to simply write it as, I think, metadata in the or some other way into the customer source definition. But I have to check the document.
Cool, thanks. we've heard from a couple of people. Are there any other folks on the line who have any experience running CRDs versus aggregate APIs they'd like to share, or thoughts based on the theories that we've discussed? Chris, your mouth is moving, but we cannot hear you. Do you have a secondary mute button, maybe like a hardware switch? Still no. I heard you earlier, so I know it was working. Nope, not yet. All right. Well, Chris is frantically typing into chat.
Okay. While Chris is typing the chat, I have one more point here. Is Eric mentioned to use the API aggregation, you need to copy like 5,000 lines of code from a sample API server. But in our current implementation, we are using API server builder, which can help us automatically generate most of the code. So this part of forking is, I think, it does not look that bad. So you don't need to really do the rebase here.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'll say about that is if that works well today, because the API machinery team thought they were going to promote API aggregation, and they decide it's not worth maintaining the API server builder because no one is using it, then that may become a burden that we have to hold ourselves.
True.
I mean, with our custom API server, we simply went and took the sample API server implementation. It's very simple, and just in one day work week, you can simply remove everything that you don't want, and then hook it with your API types and etc. and smart things. So it's very easy, doable just with the sample API server, more or less.
And how do you find it sort of keeping up with new releases of the API server code? So if you switch from 1.8 to the 1.9 API server, does that become a difficult rebasing process after you spent a day sort of ripping it out and customizing it?
So we initially vendored the entire Kubernetes repository, also the Helm repository in our other projects, and it was, it took me like almost a day, an entire day work just to get everything to work. And when we removed the Kubernetes dependency, and then everything was in the correct, there were several repositories just for the APIs, for the clients, and etc. And then from there, it was a breeze. And yeah, we've been trying just to get rid of everything that is not needed, more or less. Otherwise, when you want to do an upgrade, you waste like one day, more or less.
Okay. It sounds like a day of pain, but not unmanageable.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Yay.
Yay, wow. Okay, it only took me like 2 days to finally be able to talk on a Kubernetes call. I think it is just worthwhile to share my story. Doing this in the past, both internally and trying to code it into Kops and Kubicorn, the dependency hell, for lack of a better term, while trying to upgrade from one version of API machinery to another was a significant amount of work. Like, it wasn't just a day for me. It was like having to go through, we were using dep at the time, find the new version, recompile it, and then that would introduce other dependency problems for other packages that then need to be manually resolved. So it was like this whole exercise of adjusting constraints and figuring out how we're going to get the code to even recompile itself again, because of the whole I'm going to vendor API machinery that vendors some package that I'm also vendoring, and then we get into this whole recursive dependency problem. So it's just fair warning that there is a possibility for a lot of extra noise here going the API server route.
Where you guys were bundling sort of the core API machinery code? Okay. So it sounds like the way that Feng has done it with the builder is using sort of a separate code base from that is maybe a little bit less entangled with Kubernetes.
Yeah, I would think so, because the tooling will help you deal with some of that. So
All right. There are quite a few other people on the line. I'm curious if there are any other folks who have opinions on this.
Yeah, we had a discussion with Stefan, SCTS, and also Nikita about this, and I mean we mainly come to the conclusion that with the upcoming changes of CRDs for now, with like Node set, it would be enough to have like a custom resource definition but this is also based on our setup. We run a separate API server in front of it, and so we can use the Kubernetes API server as a storage. And but for us, CRDs would be totally enough for now. Especially like all the complexity you get to run your own API server and so on, especially upgrades and so on. And now with validation and scale and so on, most of the things we really needed was solved by CRDs.
Interesting. Can you describe briefly, so you said you run a separate API server where you put these things. Does that sound like the architecture I mentioned earlier in response to Feng, where you'd run one API server with things like pods and replica sets and a separate API server with the machine definitions? Is that what you're talking about with the second one, or is it more of like a front proxy?
Yeah, I mean, what we want to do is like we want to deploy the CRDs on the user cluster itself, so that the user itself can scale the resources, and then on our main cluster where all the REST is running, we talk to this one, and we have a separate API server who talks to the user API server of the Kubernetes cluster, and gets all the information reads the CRDs and watch the CRDs from there. So we have something like something similar like the Gardener, the SMP guys have. So we have something like a Kubernetes operator, but this runs on a separate setup, and it talks to the user cluster, and inside the cluster there are all this information stored. And so we can talk to the user API server of the Kubernetes cluster to get the information, and use our API server to do updates and so on.
Interesting. So so it sounds like for your use case, CRDs, assuming that they have things like object versioning, scale, subresource, status subresource, generated metadata, like the things that are sort of all in the roadmap for CRDs, would be both sufficient for the use cases that you guys have right now, and a simpler deployment model as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I'm hearing. Okay.
Yeah, I can second that as well. Once CRDs get those features, I think that they would satisfy what we're trying to do at Red Hat as well. And we actually have an initiative to use CRDs in some way, mostly from the standpoint of we would not like our cluster API pod to have the full access to write into the same etcd as the control plane, and we also don't want to have a separate etcd. So CRDs solves some of those requirements that we have. And personally, from doing API aggregation updates across Kube versions a number of times, I know it's a big pain, and I relish not having to do that again.
Cool. Thanks for that data point. Anybody else?
I have one basic question about this whole discussion. If we pick one solution and decide to move to the other one, is it like too hard? Like, for example, if for now we just go ahead with a separate API server, given the features that we're lacking in CRDs, and we decide to move to that later, is that really a tough job there? Any thoughts?
I mean, it depends on what features do you actually use. So if you use only the standard API source, as Robert said, without any custom sub-resources, like reboot and whatever, yeah, it would be easy to migrate from custom API server to the CRDs. But the problem is that you also set the requirement for your Kubernetes version to be, for example, 1.10 or 1.11 whenever those features come. So there's also trade-off.
You can always take that worst of both worlds approach that Service Catalog took a few versions ago, where we supported both aggregation and third-party resources.
I just about to say the same, because I think because I said API is the same. So it's just the way to deploy it. It's very possible just to support both. For different customers may have different scenario here. And yeah, controller is pretty much the same. It's just how you handle the API and the storage part.
And the API is presented to the user in exactly the same way in both cases, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Would we be defining the API the same way regardless of the implementation? Like it's not a code change?
Maybe tiny little bit, but largely the same, right? From controller side, they're still like pulling from API server and then do the reconciling. So, and even to the API aggregation, right? The controller is mostly pulling from the main API server, right? Through the aggregation. So you don't really see the difference. And so yeah.
You're saying yes, right? You're saying that the API would be the same in both cases. It's just an implementation detail of how we host the API objects, their underlying storage.
Yeah.
And the controller also should basically be the same in both cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, with only requirement that, for example, when you have generated resources, they like a generated client, and you want to do a greater of the status of that resource. It means that there should be endpoint status for your custom resource. And if it's not present, then you cannot do that API call, more or less, from your client.
Yeah. The API server have an additional flexibility, but might not be needed for some scenario. So.
Yeah, because one suggestion there would be, in terms of timeline, to get something out there, in front of more people. We could go with the approach that we have right now, constraining, the use of the external API servers, with the thought that we would be migrating, to CRDs once it has all the features, or essentially following Eric Thune's advice, but not necessarily adopting that right now, and not blocking on that specifically.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. That also allows us to, it allows us to make progress now with the features that we know exist and are on their roadmap. Doesn't give us a strong dependency on something that has no definite timeline, right? So he says, like, they might be in 110, they'll probably be in 111 if they're not in 110, but that doesn't give me high confidence that we have any sort of date when these things are actually all going to work. But it does sound like once they are there, it shouldn't be terribly difficult to switch over to use them, if it makes sense to switch at that point. Or, as Matthew said, maybe we pick both and say the controllers are the same, and it's up to the deployment how we want to host it, right, and give people the flexibility. Of course, supporting multiple ways to do it is always less desirable, but maybe makes sense for this case.
It's totally how we do things in Kubernetes.
Everything's a toolbox, right?
From our experience, when we were forced to use CRDs because of the lack of status and the metadata, we were forced to make very nasty hacks inside of the controller just to support these features. So this was pretty much our experience. So you expect something to be there, but and to operate on certain level, and then not everyone to be able to, for example, modify the status of a resource. but this thing happens, and we, for example, made a very nasty hacks just to try to get around this. And our controller in its initial state was, it was looking very bad, in my opinion, just because we had to handle all those kinds of things. And this is one thing that, I don't want to do again if it's possible.
Yeah, I think things like that are places where we can push on the API machinery team to say, if you want us to adopt CRDs, they have to work just as well as aggregated APIs, right? And we can, if we start out with aggregated APIs and we say, we're trying to switch to CRDs, but here are all the things that don't actually work, then they need to fix those because they're telling everyone to use CRDs. And if they want people to adopt CRDs, they should work just as well, right?
I didn't notice at the time, but we need cache.
All right, I don't want to spend the whole meeting on this topic. It's been about half an hour. Are there any sort of closing comments before we move on?
Did we come to a final decision?
So we have a meeting that we're going to have with Eric Toon where he's going to try to talk us into doing this. And I wanted to make sure we got feedback from the community that we could push back with him. And I think I'll also try to get him to come to this meeting next week so we can have that discussion in this forum as well and not just internally at Google. Or maybe we'll do that instead of having an internal meeting because I'm not sure it makes sense to have both. I don't want to have more meetings. I don't know about you. But I did want to sort of get input from the group so that we could have sort of more data points from a broader set of people's experiences, right? Because a number of people on the call have used CRDs in various use cases, have used aggregate APIs, have felt the pain of one or the pain of the other or the pain of both, and have valuable input for how we should go forward on the project. All right. Any other last thoughts here? Going once, going twice. Jessica is typing something into the meeting notes. Okay. So next thing on the agenda was a bug scrub and review of alpha blocking issues. So if you guys have been following the repository, Rodrigo and Karen created a whole bunch of issues over the last week or so. And then they all got tagged with sort of different milestones. So the effort here was to try and say, what are the things we actually think we need to do that would block us from calling the Cluster API alpha? And what are the things that would block us from calling it beta? And sort of starting to group those and categorize those. I went through a bunch of them last night and relabeled various things, added some comments. But I was hoping in this forum we could spend a couple of minutes going over the alpha blocking issues list. There are, last I checked, about 20 open issues. And just to skim through those briefly, get feedback from people about whether these things should be alpha blocking or not, and see if anything large is missing from the set. Because it would be nice to have sort of an agreed to set of this is what we think is alpha, so we can start burning that list down and have a realistic time frame of when we think we'll be done. How does that sound to people?
I think it would make sense, Robbie, to go over the main items, the major ones, because there's some like with usability and diagrams and documentation. So if we go over the main ones first, if you don't have time, we can punch on the other ones.
Cool. It sounds like you know which ones you think are the main ones. Do you want to drive that?
Sure. We have machine set, having a final kind of I would say, like wrapping up the work on machine set, which we haven't been able to do. I think we got some traction last week, which is great. But we kind of want to get sort of that finalized in terms of API and some of the implementation that I have going. Because the thought there is that like if this is a core part of the API that we would like to avoid changing or adding later between alpha and the beta. Any kind of any thoughts or objections?
The one thing I'll say there is a number of designs for machines and machine sets and machine deployments have involved classes. And there's another issue farther down the alpha list, number 529, about adding machine classes to the API. This also ties in my mind, to the architecture diagram to try and sort of get everybody on the same page about here are the core resource types and here's how they all fit together. And I think if we have an agreement on that, then getting a machine set API definition merged will become very trivial.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, the other major decision that we have is the machine controller, and API aggregation that we just discussed. That's being tracked there. And I would say that the machine lifecycle state machine, some of the discussion that was, I think you drove, like a couple of weeks back. I think we should finalize, how we're going to go about the lifecycle and what kind of states, we're hoping to get in the first implementation. That seems what kind of is reasonable for a first implementation in terms of lifecycle. I think those are the main ones by looking at this list. I think there's some other implementation parts that we, or usability, rerunning the cluster creation, for example. We're not necessarily blocking on any, at least right now, for alpha, we're not blocking on any other implementation. I think we only have GCP because that's the one we've been kind of working on mostly. We'd like to have, of course, the other implementations for beta, but that's also up for debate. If you feel, I know there's some different partners, that have been working on AWS, providers, and if we feel like that's something we should add for alpha, or we're going to be able to do it, for alpha, we'd be happy to add that to the release as well.
I guess the only other thing that's on the list that I would like to call out is some of the automation being put in place on the repository. Right, we've noticed over the last few days that right now it's really easy to merge things that typical. We want to make sure that the PRs that get merged by the bots, pass the fact that they build, that unit tests pass, and et cetera. So getting some of that set up. I know Chris Rousey's also been working on trying to do some work around the dependency management and clean that up a little bit. So I think that stuff is also really important to get in place before alpha. So otherwise, we're likely to cut in alpha, and then the build stops working the next day.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. We got some of the work started on a unit test, but we didn't have the issue on the alpha list, and I just said that.
Okay, folks on the call could take a list, take a look over that list. Please feel free to add things to the milestone if you think they should be there. And we'll sort of use that as the burn down list to try and get something alpha out as soon as we can. Next on the agenda, Chris, you have something about the cluster registry.
I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but if we have, somebody just jump in and tell me that we've already talked about this. But we had an internal call yesterday, and a lot of folks had a lot of questions about the differences and different concerns between the cluster registry project and our cluster API that we're working on here. Also, I joined SIG docs yesterday, and the cluster registry implementation of the cluster's API object is on its way to be merged into Kubernetes IO. So just wanted to kind of raise a flag and say, have we given any thought to the two of these projects and bringing them together? And if so, where is that whole effort or process or notes or anything that I can find?
Hey, so can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
So I've been looking into Cluster Registry and how it can use Cluster API. I don't have notes or designs right now because I'm still in early stages, but I do have an issue in the repo. If you have any thoughts, just put it in the issue, or I'm on Slack and reach out. But pretty much, I think what we are looking to do is allow registration of any cluster to any registry after the cluster is created.
And from the looks of things, this is not part of the main Kubernetes API, but just an additional API. Yeah, right? Because it's in a separate repository, it's optional, or?
So I just pasted something in the chat that formatted terribly. This is from the challenges and open questions section of the KEP. The KEP is based on a doc that Jacob Beecham had originally authored with myself. where we had sort of discussed the scope of the cluster API and whether it was going to be single cluster or multi-cluster API. And where we landed there was it made sense for the cluster API to be single cluster because the cluster registry was that sort of multi-cluster view on top of your clusters. So the way we've been thinking about it is when you want to list clusters, you go to the cluster registry to figure out where your clusters are and how to get to them. And then when you want to interact with a single cluster, you do that through the cluster API that is part of that cluster. So we haven't spent enough time with the multi-cluster SIG to actually figure out how the APIs line up to make that work correctly. But I think conceptually, that's what we're thinking right now.
I think conceptually that makes total sense. I think it's a perfectly sane approach, and I would lobby for it. My one concern is that we have two data structures, both called cluster, both with a cluster spec, that look and feel the same. And as a user, that might be confusing.
And there is a proposal that Brian Grant brought up to rename Cluster Registry to like API Server Registry, which I think makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I think there is discussion about like where exactly does the cluster definition for the cluster API cluster lives. Whether that lives on the cluster registry cluster object, whether that lives in our cluster itself is an open question.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? Because the cluster registry, the last time I looked at it, was effectively a way to share kubeconfig files without auth. And so it was basically a way to say, like, here are the API server endpoints that I know about. And it wasn't actually a list of anything describing clusters except for their location. So one option would be is we could say we do want it to actually be a cluster registry, and we want to make them use our cluster struct and our cluster types. And when you list clusters, you see the desired state of all your clusters. We have an issue there about synchronization between like where is the canonical state for those clusters stored. But that is one thing that we've considered. I don't think we've proposed that to them because we haven't thought through what that ramifications of that would be.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think my goal is to have at least a design at the end of this quarter. And so if people have other edge cases or other thoughts, please feel free to drop them in the issue, or let's talk about that on the Slack channel.
Can you add a link to the issue, to the notes as well, Karan?
Yep.
So yeah, that's a great point, Chris. That's something that we kind of have been maybe putting off a little bit because it's sort of at the fringes in some ways of like we want to get the core thing working before we try to plug it in everywhere. But if we totally ignore it, it's going to not get plugged in properly later, right? So thank you for prodding us about that. And I think that we definitely need to get those conversations moving.
Another thing that's very hot topic, but right now with these discussions and the machine API and the cluster API that we have both in our repository are there in the same group, and originally they were in different groups. So is it possible to separate them because like those things can walk each other very, very hard from the looks of things with the versioning especially?
That sounds totally reasonable to me. Can you file an issue and add the alpha milestone, or if you don't have permissions, ping me on Slack and I'll add the alpha milestone to it.
Yeah, okay.
Did that was that sufficient for your question about the registry, Chris?
Yep, I'm good.
All right. Next on the agenda, Rodrigo, you've got something about documentation.
Yeah, public source announcement. We've been improving the documentation. Right now, we have a couple of contributing documents. We're going to be restructuring that and have a single one at the root and have things a little more streamlined. But I believe we have all these steps now needed to actually for someone to start contributing to the code base. And those have been tested by someone with a brand new desktop like myself, and those kind of seem to be working, which is great. But if you have any kind of suggestions there, let us know. I have the link to the issue as well, about restructuring the documentation and have run instructions, etc. We made some progress on actually how to contribute to the whole API, and I think Karan did a good job there to explain what is needed for someone with a new provider. Whatever we need to flesh out there, let us know as well, or feel free to send it here. I'd be happy to take contributions in terms of documentation.
And it would be great if people could start adding unit tests, because we have absolutely no test coverage right now. We don't need a whole lot of them just to get coverage on critical pieces. That would be great.
Yeah, there's an open PR thread, so the initial unit tests by Karan. I think it might be worth pasting that PR as well in the notes, so people know the pattern that we're trying to follow.
Yep, I can do that.
And I think for unit tests, we want to be able to run those with Go test, right? That's the goal there, and not have to rely on something like Ginkgo to run our sort of basic code verification tests.
Right, Go test, and it tests everything.
All right, that was the end of the agenda. Does anyone else have other things they want to discuss? We've got about 10 minutes. If there are any additional topics.
Only one question. I saw that Jacob tested the minimal machine API proposal and seemed to work. Is there still some blocking things, or can it be merged now? The PR.
Yeah, it was blocked on the code not building, right? Did that get fixed since I checked yesterday?
So you should be able to merge. Yeah.
Because he tested it 10 minutes ago, or there's a comment from him 10 minutes ago. So I think then we can merge this, or?
That sounds great. Let's get it in today.
Perfect, great.
Just one clarification, because I had some notes that did we sort out some outstanding feedback on machine status error and provide the config change? I didn't follow the full PR, so I just had some notes of myself on that.
I don't know if that was resolved, but I think the place we're at with the machine PR that Sebastian's referring to is we wanted to get that in, and then we could sort of iterate on fixing it after it was merged, but get the initial one in. So we don't have it outstanding still.
That's totally reasonable. Yeah, I just want to bring up, because we might need, if that's still outstanding, we need to track those separately. That's okay.
Yeah, and there were a couple of issues I filed from that PR of things we wanted to follow up and fix after it was in. So if this is another one in that case, there might already be a bug, but if not, please file another bug.
Just added them to the note to the meeting notes, and I'll file issues to make sure they're tracked.
Yeah, I think I filed the issues for both of those.
Oh, perfect. Perfect.
I can try to find them. We should make sure they're on the alpha list, because we should definitely resolve those questions before alpha. Any other agenda topics people want to add? Going once, going twice. Sold. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. I will try to convince Eric to come join us next week. Hopefully he doesn't have a conflict at this time. If not, we may need to schedule another time to chat with him as a community group. And if that's the case, I'll post something in Slack and send an email out to the mailing list to figure out when people are available. But hopefully it'll be at this time next week. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you next time. Take care.